So there I was, floating in the observation deck of the research vessel, Scholarly Pursuit. And yes, that's actually what they named it, because apparently the Galactic Council's Department of Creative Nomenclature was having a particularly uninspired decade, watching what could only be described as the most ridiculous display of interspecies confusion I'd witnessed in my 47 years of xenobiology research. The subject of our study was one Dr. Elena Vasquez, a human xenobiologist who had somehow convinced the ethics committee that studying the Kitharan hunting packs of Kepler 442 Phi b required direct immersive observation. What this actually meant, of course, was that she wanted to play with the space puppies. But you can't exactly put that in a grant proposal without getting laughed out of the academic review board. The Kitharans, for those blissfully unaware, are what you'd get if you crossed a wolf with a saber-toothed tiger, and then decided that wasn't terrifying enough, so you made them the size of earth horses and gave them an intelligence that bordered on sentient. They hunt in coordinated packs, communicate through subsonic frequencies that can shatter reinforced ceramics, and have been known to take down prey 3 times their size through sheer tactical brilliance. Naturally, Elena thought they were adorable. Day 43 of observation, I muttered into my recording device, watching through the long-range sensors as Elena sat cross-legged in the middle of what could generously be called a clearing, but was more accurately described as the place where things go to become lunch. Subject continues to display the characteristic human inability to recognize when something wants to eat her. The pack had been circling her for the better part of an hour, and I was starting to wonder if I should intervene or just start writing her obituary. The alpha, a magnificent specimen they dubbed Shadow Fang, because apparently everyone in xenobiology has the naming creativity of a 12-year-old writing fantasy novels, was performing what the textbooks called threat assessment behavior, but what I preferred to think of as deciding which seasoning would work best. Elena, meanwhile, was doing something that defied all logic, reason, and basic survival instincts. She was taking notes, with a stylus, on a tablet, while surrounded by apex predators who were having a very serious discussion about whether humans were more of a main course or exotic appetizer sort of meal. The cubs, because of course there were cubs, the universe has a twisted sense of humor like that, were hanging back behind their parents, occasionally letting out those adorable little whimpering sounds that in any other species would indicate playfulness, but in Kitharans typically meant, I'm practicing my death cry for when I grow up to be a proper nightmare creature. That's when it happened. Elena, in a moment of what I can only assume was temporary insanity brought on by prolonged exposure to academic pressure, decided to reach for her water canister. Now, this should have been a simple action. Humans do this thousands of times without incident, but apparently, when you're sitting in the middle of a Kitharan pack assessment circle, even the most mundane activities become opportunities for catastrophic failure. The canister slipped, because of course it did. Elena lunged forward to catch it, because humans have this bizarre compulsion to save inanimate objects that are perfectly capable of surviving a 2-foot drop. Her hand scraped against the jagged edge of a rock formation that looked like it had been specifically designed by malevolent geological forces to cause maximum inconvenience to visiting xenobiologists. The cut wasn't large. I've seen paper cuts with more dramatic flair, but it was enough to draw blood, and that blood was enough to change everything. The reaction from the pack was immediate and completely unprecedented in 40 years of Kitharan behavioral studies. Shadowfang, who had been in the middle of what I was reasonably certain was a threatening posture, suddenly went rigid. His ears perked up in a way that would have been comical if it wasn't so utterly bewildering. The other adults started making a sound I'd never heard before, a low, almost mournful whine that seemed to resonate through the ground itself. But the cubs. Oh, the cubs were what really made this whole situation slide from academically interesting into career-defining moment that would either make me famous or get me committed to a psychiatric facility. They approached Elena with all the caution of creatures who had suddenly realized they were in the presence of something sacred. Not dangerous. Sacred. There's a difference, and apparently, Kitharans understand it better than most sentient species. The smallest cub, barely larger than a terrestrial wolf pup, but with those characteristic crystal blue eyes that seem to look right through you, reached Elena first. It sniffed at her bleeding hand with the delicacy of a master sommelier evaluating a particularly rare vintage. Then, with movement so gentle I had to check my recording equipment to make sure it wasn't malfunctioning. The cub began to lick the wound. "Well," I said to nobody in particular, because my research assistant had the good sense to be back on the ship filing safety reports, "this is either the most beautiful interspecies moment in recorded history, or I'm about to watch a human get very slowly and methodically devoured. Either way, it's going in the journal." The other cubs followed suit, forming what could only be described as a healing circle around Elena's hand. They took turns, each one approaching with the same reverent care, each lick precise and purposeful. It was like watching a religious ceremony conducted by creatures who had never heard of religion but somehow understood its fundamental principles. Elena, to her credit, sat perfectly still. Whether this was due to scientific training, survival instincts, or complete paralytic terror was impossible to determine from my observation post, but I had to admire her commitment to the research process. Her tablet lay forgotten beside her, stylus rolling away into the alien grass, as she became part of something that no xenobiology textbook had ever prepared her for. The adult Kitharans had formed their own circle around the cubs, but their posture had shifted from predatory assessment to something that looked distinctly like protection. They were guarding Elena. From what, I had no idea, since she was currently in the middle of what was arguably the safest clearing on the entire continent, surrounded by creatures that could probably take on a small army and win. But that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part came when the sun began to set. Kitharans are crepuscular hunters. As the day transitions to night, they should have been preparing for their evening hunt. This is when they're most active, most dangerous, most likely to remind you that for all their beauty and intelligence, they are very much apex predators with a food chain position that humans are nowhere near. Instead, they settled down for what appeared to be an extended camping trip. Shadowfang positioned himself directly behind Elena, close enough that she could feel his breathing, far enough away to avoid crowding. The other adults arranged themselves in a protective formation that would have made military strategists weep with envy. And the cubs, apparently deciding that Elena was now their personal responsibility, curled up around her like living blankets. I watched through the night as the pack that should have been terrorizing the local ecosystem instead held what could only be described as a vigil. They didn't hunt. They didn't patrol. They didn't do any of the things that 40 years of research said they should be doing. They just stayed. Elena eventually fell asleep, probably from exhaustion or shock or the sheer surreal nature of her situation. The cubs adjusted their positions to keep her warm, their subsonic purring creating a gentle vibration that seemed to help her rest. The adults took turns maintaining watch, but their attention wasn't focused outward toward potential threats. It was focused inward, on the small human who had somehow become the center of their world. Day 44, I recorded as the sun began to rise. The pack has officially broken every established pattern of behavior. They didn't hunt. They didn't patrol territory. They didn't engage in any of the activities that define their species. Instead, they spent the night protecting a sleeping xenobiologist who probably has no idea she just participated in the most significant interspecies contact event in recorded history. Elena woke up slowly, probably expecting to find herself alone or possibly digested. Instead, she found herself surrounded by creatures who greeted her consciousness with gentle nuzzling and what could only be described as expressions of relief. The smallest cub, who had apparently appointed himself as her personal guardian during the night, presented her with her dropped water canister, carefully carried over and placed beside her with the solemnity of a religious offering. The cut on her hand had healed remarkably well. Not completely. Human physiology doesn't work that way. But the bleeding had stopped, and there was no sign of infection. Whether this was due to the cub's ministrations, the unique properties of Kitharan saliva, or just exceptional luck was something that would require months of analysis to determine. But that analysis would have to wait, because what happened next was even more unprecedented. Shadowfang approached Elena directly, moving with the careful deliberation of someone conducting a formal ceremony. He lowered his massive head until it was level with hers, close enough that she could see her reflection in his amber eyes, and made a sound that had never been recorded in any Kitharan behavioral study. It was almost musical, a complex series of tones that seemed to convey meaning beyond simple communication. The other adults joined in, creating a harmony that resonated through the clearing and probably beyond. The cubs added their own voices, higher and sweeter, turning the whole thing into something that sounded less like animal communication and more like a choral arrangement. Elena, apparently deciding that scientific protocol could go hang itself, reached out and gently touched Shadowfang's muzzle. The great hunter, the apex predator, the creature that had been known to take down armored prey with casual efficiency, closed his eyes and leaned into her touch like an oversized house cat seeking affection. And that, I said to my recording device, is the moment xenobiology became significantly more complicated. The pack eventually dispersed, but not before each member had approached Elena for what appeared to be a formal farewell. The cubs were reluctant to leave, requiring gentle encouragement from their parents, and even then they kept looking back as if trying to memorize every detail of the human who had somehow become important to them. Elena sat in the clearing for a long time after they left, staring at her healed hand and probably trying to process what had just happened. I didn't blame her. I'd been observing the whole thing through sensors and advanced recording equipment, and I still wasn't entirely sure I believed it. The implications were staggering. If a simple cut could trigger such a profound behavioral change in an entire pack, what did that say about Kitharan psychology? About their social structures? About their capacity for what could only be described as empathy? More importantly, what did it say about humans? I'd spent 4 decades studying interspecies interactions, and I'd seen the full spectrum of responses to human contact: fear, aggression, curiosity, indifference. All the reactions you'd expect when introducing a new variable into an established ecosystem. But I'd never seen anything like this. I'd never seen an entire species seem to recognize something in humans that we don't even recognize in ourselves. Elena eventually made her way back to the extraction point, where my field team was waiting with expressions that ranged from professional concern to barely concealed panic. The mission had been scheduled to last 2 more weeks, but after reviewing the recordings, we all agreed that continuing would be both unnecessary and potentially dangerous. Not because of the Kitharans, but because of what Elena had become to them. She spent the journey back to the research station in uncharacteristic silence, occasionally examining the small scar on her hand as if it held the secrets of the universe. Maybe it did. Maybe that tiny mark represented something fundamental about the relationship between species, about the capacity for understanding that transcends evolutionary boundaries. Or maybe it was just a cut that happened to bleed at exactly the right moment in exactly the right place, to trigger an instinctual response that we don't understand yet. The thing about xenobiology is that every answer leads to 10 new questions, and every breakthrough makes you realize how little you actually know about the universe and your place in it. Elena's encounter with the Kitharan pack didn't solve any of the fundamental mysteries of interspecies contact. If anything, it made them more complex, but it did prove something that I'd suspected throughout my career but had never been able to document. Sometimes, the most profound scientific discoveries happen not in laboratories or through controlled experiments, but in those messy, unpredictable moments when careful planning gives way to pure chance, and the universe decides to remind you that it's far stranger and more wonderful than any theory could encompass. The report I filed after Elena's mission became required reading at every major xenobiology institute in the galaxy. Not because it provided answers, but because it raised questions that forced us to reconsider everything we thought we knew about intelligence, empathy, and the mysterious threads that connect all living things. Elena, for her part, never went back to Kepler 442b. She said she didn't need to. That single night had given her enough material for a lifetime of research, enough insight to reshape her understanding of what it means to be human in a universe full of other thinking beings. The last I heard, she was working on a new theory about interspecies emotional resonance, something about how certain actions or conditions can trigger responses that transcend normal behavioral patterns. It was complicated stuff, full of mathematical models and biochemical analyses that made my head spin. But every time she presented her findings, she would start by showing a picture of her scarred hand and telling the story of the night a pack of alien predators decided that taking care of one small human was more important than following millions of years of evolutionary programming. And every time, her audience would sit in stunned silence, trying to comprehend what it means when the universe presents you with evidence of something so beautiful and inexplicable that it challenges every assumption you've ever made about the nature of consciousness and connection. That's the thing about humans, I've realized after all these years of studying them from a distance. They have this remarkable ability to stumble into situations that should terrify them, and somehow transform those situations into opportunities for understanding. They bleed, and somehow that bleeding becomes a bridge between species that should have nothing in common except the shared experience of existing in the same vast, strange universe. It's ridiculous, really. It defies logic and probability and basic common sense. It's also, possibly, the most hopeful thing I've ever witnessed in 4 decades of trying to make sense of the cosmos and our place in it. The Kitharans still hunt, of course. They're apex predators, and that's what apex predators do. But according to the latest reports from Kepler 442b, they've started doing something new. When the cubs are old enough to join their first hunt, the pack takes them to the clearing where Elena bled. They sit in a circle, just as they did that night, and the adults teach them something that isn't covered in any behavioral study. They teach them about the night they chose compassion over instinct, understanding over hunger, and discovered that sometimes the most important prey is the kind you decide not to catch. And somewhere in that lesson, in that strange ritual that bridges the gap between human and alien, predator and protector, there's a truth that's bigger than xenobiology or scientific understanding or any of the careful categories we use to make sense of the universe. There's the recognition that consciousness, in all its forms, carries with it the capacity for surprise, for growth, for connections that defy explanation and transcend the boundaries of species and evolution and everything we think we know about how the world works. It's a truth that's written in scar tissue and remembered in the songs that alien cubs learn before they learn to hunt, and it's probably the most important discovery any of us will make in our lifetime. Even if it did start with a perfectly ordinary paper cut in the middle of nowhere, witnessed by creatures who understood its significance better than the human who caused it. Sometimes the universe has a sense of humor, sometimes it has a sense of poetry, and sometimes, if you're very lucky, it has both.